English translation 916th Contact Saturday, August 23rd, 2025, 6:47 HRS.
Here I am also, Eduard, my friend, and I should report to you that Bermunda and Enjana thank you once again. For what you advised them was, in their opinion, the correct thing to do, although I am amazed that you can apparently give such advice that the two girls are happy and content. Obviously, the last few weeks have not been like that in any wise.
I know that, because I also noticed that when they were here, but now I know why, which I did not know before. But that remains my secret. Besides, you should not be surprised, because I have been confronted with these kinds of problems several times in my life. Once when I was still at school, and also later, when I was an adult, I was confronted with the same problems twice more.
You were obviously a good counselor as a boy, because my grandfather wrote that in his annals, how he specifically mentioned that and judged you according to your traits, how he also put that in writing, which I have photographed to read to you, because I think you should know how and what he thought regarding you. I was also able to read that my grandfather was instructed to accompany you from birth, to stand by you and teach you. However, I was only aware of a few fragments of this as a result of Ta's explanations, which is why I can only now take note of a few more things, because I also found documents in my grandfather's notes that are written both in German and in my mother tongue, and which contain his judgments regarding your personality, which is why he was commissioned by the committee at the time. He noted on the 6th of May, 1950, that he was obliged to accompany you since your birth, to teach you, to bring you into the past and the future, and to let you see and also partially experience reality and its truth, but about which you are to keep silence for the rest of your life. And I would like to say that you take this very seriously, and even conceal certain knowledge from me, who I am supposed to know.
Excuse me, but at that time Sfath said, and I remember this very well, that I should keep silence towards everyone.
And that, Quetzal, my friend, means for me that it really should be everyone.
What I am allowed to say and can take responsibility for, that is what I do.
But there is a lot you do not disclose.
True, but one promise I have never broken in my lifetime, and I also will not, because I have committed myself to honesty, and that is the way it stays.
Well, that is clear for me to understand. I have only been able to read part of what I have found regarding his judgment of your personality, because everything is extremely extensive, which is why I have only read a little so far. I found some of it particularly interesting, and I want to ask you if you even know what my grandfather wrote about you in his assessment of your early years.
No, he never mentioned anything about that. Besides, I did not even know that he had a judgment to make about me because he never said anything about that, or also never even hinted at it.
That is what I thought. That is why I also copied it down, and I want to read it to you.
I do know that Sfath scrutinized me, because fortunately I was not blind, and I was always attentive. So I noticed that he was constantly looking at my fingers, in everything and everyone.
However, he never said a word about it, but I could always see from his physiognomy that he was satisfied and never criticized me.
That was also not surprising, because his overall judgment of your personality did not cause him to reprimand me, quite the opposite.
After all, he also never did that, unlike the religious sectarians who criticized me at every opportunity.
You will probably never forget that. Also, certainly not by the fact that the whole thing is in the past and you do not usually think about it.
Right, and that is why it is also not necessary for us to talk about it.
That is also true, but if you are interested, I would like to read you what my grandfather wrote back then as an assessment of your personality, because he was in charge of it.
I am not really interested in that, because I know that I have always tried to behave correctly and decently and humanely in life, and have never done anything wrong to a human being or any other living being. I am well aware that I am no angel, and that I at least cause offense by the fact that I always say uninhibitedly and openly what is effectively the truth, which unfortunately always causes anger among those human beings whom I step on the tail. Especially among religious believers, who do not understand that I am not attacking them as human beings, but the hypocrisy of the religion in question. This, just as they also do not realize that I do not want to discuss this topic with them, because I do not want to argue with them about their faith, nor do I want to dissuade them from their erroneous religious beliefs. If they fall away from their erroneous delusion of faith, then this cannot be done by me, because I do not indoctrinate them, but they have to become effectively self-thinking and self-deciding, which then requires that they finally recognize reality and its truth and turn to it alone. They have to recognize for themselves, through their own uninfluenced, rational and clear thoughts, that it is not a dear God, Savior, or Saint, or their God creation that they believe is omnipotent, but the existential nature of everything that exists, which we earthlings simply call nature. This is because, at least at present, we have no other term for it. Creation is nothing other than the universe-wide nature with all its fauna and flora in the entire sevenfold realm of creation, the entire cosmos with all the Milky Ways, the celestial bodies or the suns, as well as the planets, the space dust, the meteors, comets and asteroids, etc. Creation is therefore nothing other than the all-encompassing nature, which is the entirety of the existence and activity of everything existential, and which can and may be called self-creation in independence, with good and clear knowledge and understanding, as it can also be called creation entity, or all-creating creation entity, etc., or simply nature or nature entity, as it has been since time immemorial, or simply what it really is, namely creation. And this has absolutely nothing to do with an imaginary and fantasized God, Savior, or Saint, as is contrary to this through lies and deception in various forms of religious delusion to all believers in the delusion of God, believers in the delusion of salvation, and otherwise all believers in every sect and religion of every faith of every kind and form.
Effectively, no further explanation is needed, because with your words you have clearly stated
where Bartley de most hold, as we say when something is clearly stated and explained, which is correct and takalis.
I know that, because you have said that before, but I also want to say, in deviation, that there is real and total peace here in the Ankar universe, and among all the peoples of our Federation, and among all human beings. And according to the earthly calendar, there has been for almost 53,000 years. And you are aware of the connections, so I do not need to mention them specifically. In our country, everything is federally regulated in such a way that crime and criminality do not exist, nor does addiction to drugs because such products do not exist in our country. Alcoholism and drug addiction, etc., which are prevalent among many Earth humans, also do not exist in our country, although such products are in use here. What I want to say, however, is that it would be correct and good if I could read out and explain to you what my grandfather wrote as a clear judgment about you, and how he summarized it with various other explanations that concern you in the future and also unpleasant events in the earthly world. You cannot, I think, give me any reason why I should not do this because
Your words and your will are again your heavenly kingdom.
that counts as an invitation for me, and so hear then what my grandfather's clear judgment was, to which he was officially commissioned, and still privately elsewhere created some things and also named them with separate insertions and provided them with special notes in addition to that, but which I leave out because everything he passed on to make it known era-wide and also Federation-wide, because our peoples were interested in it. But now listen to what he has written, which you will not know.
Excerpt from Sfath's notes of May 6, 1950, 2346 HRS.
As a commissioner, I have to assess Eddie, whom I will henceforth call Edie for short, and clarify what emerges in him as a whole in relation to his true humanity, which encompasses a great deal and also made it necessary for me to concern myself strictly and extensively with his future way of life and to fathom what will emerge for him in life. At the same time, I also want to mention various things, such as events and incidents, as well as events that will undoubtedly occur far into the future after the millennium. In anticipation of this, however, I had to intervene before Eddie was born to ensure his life safety, because at the age of 3 months, he could only have maintained his vital functions for another 8 hours due to pneumonia, despite the efforts of Dr. Strebel. Through my intervention, however, the loss of vital functions was averted and recovery was also initiated, after which Eddie made a full recovery within 11 days. Note: at the age of 6 months, Eduard fell ill with pneumonia a second time, and this time Sfath also intervened again because Dr. Strebel was unable to do anything. Apparently, this tendency to pneumonia had been passed on to him by his father, who, like Eduard later on, suffered from this illness once or twice a year, which also affected his son likewise for many years. I had to judge both the totality of his intellect and reason, as well as his intelligentum and the resulting intelligence, but I also had to fathom his character, his way of thinking, and his abilities and behavior, as well as his real attitude in relation to various positive values and negative unvalues of many kinds. Eddie is truly the correct personality to fulfill the mission of spreading the teachings of Nocodemion. As I accompany him and have to judge him in the negative and positive, as well as in all the values and negative values of his character, his attitude and his overall behavior, I have come to realize that at his earthly age he is more mature and also much more capable of judgment than an earth human of the same age and gender. He has traveled with me in past and future ages, whereby he is many years older than his earthly age, due to the chronokinesis that has taken place and is necessary in each case. This will often be the case in the time to come, as will also be the case with my successors, as a result of which he is years older than his earthly lifetime. His logical thinking, as well as his independence and extremely responsible self-action, unfortunately still lead him to overlook the emotional needs of certain adult male fellow human beings who have fallen into the faith of a strict religious community and who behave dismissively towards him and maliciously harass him with insults. This is in contrast to other men, children and female adults, with the exception of a woman called Harat, who has been persecuting and abusing Eddie for 6 years with men who are like-minded towards her, but about whom he says nothing to his parents, just as he also remains silent to his priest friend and to everyone else, and endeavors to come to terms with everything that has happened to him. This is very necessary for him, because he will be confronted with it for the rest of his life, as I was able to explain to him in an understandable way based on my knowledge of my future. This misses, and this has been going on for years in such a way that he is beaten and demanded with evil threats that he should worship the dear God and his alleged son, the Savior, and ask them for forgiveness, as well as join the religious community, because God would help him at a young age. This is because Eddie has not been a believer in religion since a very young age, and judges religions as nonsensical, just as he was never encouraged to believe by his parents. As a result, he is not a confirmed Catholic and also not a confirmed Protestant, which will remain the same throughout his life, but will not prevent him from getting to the bottom of various denominations, their church services and their delusions of faith, the rituals, confusing faith-related symbolic acts, and the traditions, ceremonies and festivals, etc. He is very interested in all of this. This interests him greatly, which he will endeavor to do, and, if necessary, also join the various denominations pro forma in order to gain better, closer, and deeper insights and knowledge so that he can advise his fellow human beings if they ask him for advice. However, this will not prevent him throughout his life from appreciating and honoring human beings as such, despite their faith, and from practicing non-violence towards them, as will generally be one of his life's métiers. As a result of his passion for non-violence, he will therefore endure much suffering and lies and offenses that are harmful to him, which will deprive him of his freedom, cause him suffering, pain, and often also put his life in danger, but about which he will never complain. He will always go his way courageously and honestly, only in foreign countries, where he will pursue his livelihood for many years, sometimes through dangerous labor, and will also lose his left arm. But this will not prevent him from carrying out his many activities as if he had two hands. This is how he will end his many years abroad for the last time in Greece, when he will marry in this country at great risk, father a daughter and two sons, and lead a risky marriage for around 32 years, and then divorce. But it will be that the last years of his risky marriage will bring him true love from a woman around 20 years younger than him. And this love will be mutual and last until his departure from his life on Earth. When Eddie returns to his homeland for the rest of his life, knowing, wise, and then founds a community and establishes a crossroads that is decisive for the whole Earth, in a place that has been well known to him since his adolescence, in diligent helpfulness and cooperation with faithful collaborators and interested parties, then the place will become the center and crossroads of the worldwide spread of Nocademian's teaching. Eddie is very intelligent, but headstrong, so he is often misjudged, which will also be the case in the future, and will therefore often give the impression that he is not quite correct in his mind and reason. However, this deception hides the reality that he is very practical and extremely humble through his own initiative, much more so than it will also appear in the future. He is constantly inspired by what he can achieve at a young age through hard work, and will also do so in the future. So he will always be tirelessly active during his lifetime, and will learn and practice many different trades. He is extremely talented and also modest and charming in a way that has nothing of artifice about it. He sees both the big and the whole, as well as the small and the tiny, as well as the smallest details of what really exists, which also results in relation to the whole of life and existence, human beings, animals, creatures, birds, water creatures, and all living beings in general. In certain situations, he becomes eccentric, consciously concealing many of the values of his outstanding personality, which nevertheless reflect many conventional or old-fashioned truths that can only be recognized when he is closely observed. Eddie is unusually flexible, and therefore able to work in a team in the best way for a leader, as he will also do in the application of his own working groups in civil engineering, as well as in the leadership of the community he is creating and founding, which will teach and spread the teachings of Nocademian worldwide. He will use his intelligence, deeds, and strength to do all of this, and seek to teach human beings on this earth that they should not harbor the planet, but rather shape it into a better world, and not destroy it. But contrary to this, the opposite will nevertheless be done. Because in the future, this planet Earth will be threatened by a sheer overmass of humanity that will become completely indifferent and irresponsible, as well as morally depraved. It will be a population of the Earth that, as a result of irrationality, greed, crime, and degenerate blind addiction to wealth, criminality, delusion, addiction, crime, murder, and wars, etc., will fall prey to many evils, addictions, and machinations, etc., in a worldwide manner. This will already cause several wars in the next 5 decades, but also in the third, and thus new millennium, whereby, in this respect, America's leaders in particular will cause wars with lies and deceit in relation to their irresponsible greed for power and lust for war, and afflicted by mythomania. This will happen in a very wise way, from now on in the coming fourth decade, and also shortly after the turn of the millennium, as well as also about 20 years after that, as war disaster will break out in Eastern Europe, indirectly through the fault of the American state leadership. In the future, not only wars will bring disaster to Earth, but also increased criminality, crime, greed for wealth, epidemics, rampantly spreading diseases, rampant religious delusions, mental illnesses, and cancer. However, many diseases and illnesses of various kinds will also appear due to the unstoppable rise of irresponsible toxic pollution of the atmosphere, as well as the water and all plant foods that are planted and harvested outdoors, or also those that will be treated with toxins in greenhouses and similar facilities in the future. All of this will endanger all life, as well as a generalized dangerous Aussatung of a large part of an irresponsibly and rapidly growing Earth humans. It will fall prey to an unparalleled indifference and irresponsibility and, in some cases, a degeneracy that has already begun. Human beings around the world will also be afflicted by the delusional disorder of pyromania, a monomania that causes a pathological obsession or a solitary delusion, and thus an obsession that can lead to uncontrollable frenzy in blind rage. As a result, many forests around the world will burn, be destroyed and devastated by arson, along with much of their wildlife of all genus and species. But this will inevitably also happen to the plant world. Only a few of the fires will be of natural origin, such as those caused by lightning strikes or unusual heat events. As a rule, it will be the pyromaniac mania of human beings that will cause many fires to be set in forests all over the earth in the future. Although in the course of time, the danger will also arise and may become possible that buildings will be damaged and even destroyed by fire if the whole thing cannot be stopped. In any case, the pyromaniacs will irrevocably carry out their disastrous activities in many countries on Earth, and thus destroy the forests. This is because in the case of monomania, the human being is driven by a violent urge which he cannot resist due to the strength of the delusion. His delusional disorder corresponds to a mental disorder that manifests itself extremely as an idea or impulse and as an extremely compulsive and uncontrollable preoccupation, as is equally the case with other delusional people of every wise and kind. In just a few months, the great evil of all the coming negative changes will begin to degenerate, namely when the enmity in Korea degenerates into a vicious war, which the American military leadership will take over, as it will then, as it has done since time immemorial, continue its delusions of world domination. The North Korean army will invade South Korea and start a war. But America will take part in the fight, causing the deaths of nearly 40,000 people, a war that will cost the Korean people millions of human lives. This war, and also various following wars that will be waged by America, or with its involvement in this century and the next millennium, will have an extremely negative impact on the whole world, as was the case with the last World War, the aftermath of which will be seen in the Middle East, with completely degenerate and monstrous war crimes. These will inevitably come from Israel, which was founded last year, and from a Palestinian terrorist organization that will be called Hamas Notbili, Arabic for zeal of faith, etc. This terrorist organization will then start the war. But a Hitler-like Israeli warlord will commit monstrous war crimes with impunity, which will be as criminal as all those committed during the last World War under Hitler's leadership. This, while a strange world war lasting several years will be waged in Eastern Europe through the fault and secret cooperation of America, because weapons, etc., will be supplied to one of the warring parties as a result of inexplicable hatred of the other warring party, whereby the war will continue for a long time in a senseless and irresponsible manner. Then the danger comes from the action of supplying weapons, and as a result of the biased and lowly intelligent, thoughtless and confused speeches of the incompetent and loud-mouthed leaders of Europe, because this leads to an escalation of the other party and forms a retaliatory reaction that threatens a far-reaching war. This will therefore be solely through the hateful ones who will supply weapons, etc., as well as through the cooperation of America. While Russia, as the Soviet Union will then be called, and will lose this name, will oppose it, and extremely unpleasant things will come to the fore. Because the powerful of the European states, who are addicted to a complex hatred, will drive this nonsensically high, for which there can then be no real explanation. All order among the peoples will be undermined in a wise way, because the powerful empires of the world will seize might and ultimately deprive the peoples completely of their freedom, because they will subjugate all peoples through constantly new laws, decrees, and rules, etc., in the state governments. These powerful people of all kinds will therefore completely rob the human beings of the nations of their own ability to make decisions and act, and even thinking for themselves may become a criminal offense. Private finance will also succumb completely and fall under state control and bank control, because the peoples will not endeavor to prevent this due to their indifference, fear, irresponsibility, and belief in authority, as a result of which the peoples will fall into absolute immaturity in this respect. In this respect, a new technology will also be introduced, which the peoples in general will not be able to resist and will lose their independence, which will begin in a fundamentally uncontrolled manner in just 3 decades, and then take its unstoppable development and course into the next millennium, catching humanity unprepared. This will also be the case with mechanical calculating machines, note Billy, today called computers, as well as automatic machines, laboratory machines, note Billy, today called robots, which were first invented and constructed more than 80 years ago. Note, the oldest surviving automaton is the Strasbourg rooster from around 1350, which will very quickly cause a furore. This development, which currently still appears futuristic, will, however, progress very quickly to the extent that human-like machines, Billy's note, androids, will be developed from it, whereby their development will soon begin, and this new technology, Billy's note, androids, or artificial intelligences, which will look like human beings in form, and will hardly be distinguishable from them, will ultimately become independent and bring disaster to Earth humans. This, together with this, will also result in many human beings becoming unemployed and even work-shy, which will cause crime and criminality to rise and order to largely collapse, and violence and murder to become a reactionary tendency and the norm. From the beginning of the next millennium, artificial intelligence will be used worldwide by state leaders, administrations, financial institutions, the military, corporations, and also many companies, as well as criminal elements, criminal organizations, and all kinds of groups. It will be a long time before the people suspect and then also realize the resulting disaster, when they finally recognize its origins and realize that everything is based on this and is happening because of the general indifference to the incapacitating machinations of the state leaders and their like-minded representatives, etc. This realization will then be late. But this realization will then be too late to do anything about it. Furthermore, it will come about that the complete indifference and irresponsibility of Earth humans will cause them to grow massively into a sheer mass, which will largely bring about the coming destruction and annihilation of the planet, namely through the senseless and irresponsible exploitation of its natural resources, which will result in a dangerous displacement of the planet's interior. This, as the future Earth humans absolutely thoughtless and completely unscrupulous, criminal machinations have already been in the making for some time and will have such an effect in the coming period that the climate will be completely overturned and thus bring undreamt of catastrophes and zone shifts. And what has been going on for a long time, but will become ever more blatant, will continue to happen irrevocably. The majority of the Earth's plant world, as well as the wild world of life forms that move themselves in the most diverse wise, will largely be driven into the abyss and to the edge of the abyss of all living things. That is as far as this is concerned, which is absolutely certain to be inevitable and to come. The devastating and destructive things that have already occurred in the past as a result of evil and irrationality, as well as the uncreative attitude and similar actions of Earth humans, are threatening to repeat themselves in a terrible way, for which America already created the beginning 5 years ago with the Hiroshima-Nagasaki crime. In the future, there is a threat that something similar will happen again, and in a much worse wise, because the time of rapid development has come, and this will bring more and more dangerous things that ultimately can no longer be controlled by Earth humans. Thus, from the next millennium onwards, everything will be so far and dangerously developed that slowly but surely all control will fade away, which will result in Billy's note. I cannot justify openly or even rudimentarily mentioning the following predictions, which contain 104 sentences warningly describing events that reach very far into the future. Furthermore, all this will be of such importance for Earth humans and all life on Earth, as well as for the continued existence of the planet itself, into the very distant future, which Eddie was partly allowed to fathom together with me. However, as far as Eddie himself is concerned, his calmness can have a downside, and he can be rebellious in other ways. But he is also full of charisma and truly a lovable original. He often thinks and behaves eccentrically, as I've already explained, especially in a progressive and extremely imaginative and inventive wise, whereby I have to mention that he is a freedom-loving human being and is averse to conventional boundaries. Unfortunately, neither now nor later in his life on Earth can he bring about and realize his visions, either now or in the future of his teaching work, to the extent that he sees as necessary, and knows that this would be necessary in order to bring humanity on this Earth to the working mind and to reason, as well as to true humanity and peace. Thus he will only achieve what is possible, namely, only a small minority of Earth humans who understand his words of real truth and the Nocademionic teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life presented since time immemorial, thinking for themselves and not in the form of a belief. Consequently, they will recognize their truthful reality and be able to follow the teaching. This will enable them to benefit from their own striving and unfolding towards true human development, and to apply their correct and true behavior in this respect. But back to Eddie, who, as I have already explained, is a true original and full of charisma, but eccentric, as I have also already explained. He is a progressive thinker and is very imaginative and inventive, constantly trying to realize everything, often with success. He has self-imagined ideals, and he gets on well with human beings who have a similar way of thinking, a love of freedom, and a desire to pursue righteous interests and behavior. His whole being is real, and therefore effectively true knowledge and ability, as well as honest helpfulness, whereby he has already, at his still young age, developed a very exceptional potential of ability to give realistic and valuable guidance, counseling, and advice, and to offer valuable suggestions. So he is a human being, which I want to repeat again, because this corresponds to the need to understand him. A freedom-loving visionary, a human being with ideals that he himself has conceived and found in his world of thought. For his fellow human beings, he is difficult to grasp in terms of his entire being, as the human being often appears and behaves in a very changeable, distant manner. He is usually non-committal because, really taken, he does not want to bind himself to anything that obliges him. For his métier is that not a verbal or written commitment, but one in self-knowledge and as an absolutely vital duty to fulfill what is rightly, what is to be done. This sometimes makes him seem aloof and reserved, almost cool, and if his ideas and diverse plans do not work out and fulfill themselves as he imagines, then he can also become uncomfortable in his behavior, because the failure of a thing contradicts his standing on his own 2 feet. So he continues to doggedly pursue what he has undertaken until he succeeds in achieving it. This uncomfortableness also manifests itself very strongly when a person close to him behaves disorderly in any actions, speech, or behavior, because then he does not shy away from becoming very vocal, which can even turn into shouting. But this is as far as it goes, because the emotion of anger that arises and breaks through only comes to the fore through the shouting and only degenerates into words, but never into anger or rage or even violence. Nothing is worse for Eddie than to be dependent in any wise, especially on persons whom he cannot correct with reason and good and valuable advice. The same applies to circumstances that are arranged by fellow human beings in a way that is wrong and also unworthy and harmful to him or others. For him, this means that he is most satisfied when he himself holds the reins and everything always runs, is done and produced pedantically, is lived freely and in a correct and responsible manner, and in a way that fully corresponds to correctness. As a conscious human being, Eddie has great respect for the thoughts and feelings as well as the emotions of his fellow human beings, although he often suppresses them towards himself, especially when he has to provide valuable advice or real physical help. And with regard to his entire behavior in this respect, I have quite specific details to mention, which require a lot more explanation, and therefore cannot simply be mentioned in a wise manner. So it can be said that he is completely sincere and absolutely consistent in his behavior, whereby every word and everything he says also corresponds to what he thinks and acts accordingly. Although he is sociable, helpful, and tolerant, he is also unpredictable and erratic. But this does not refer to negative things, but to the fact that sometimes his thoughts and actions unexpectedly and suddenly correspond positively to new values, which are generally correct and progressive. He is absolutely reliable, humorous, and good-natured, as well as friendly, although he has nothing against socializing if it is absolutely necessary, but otherwise he likes to avoid it. Eddie is always full of energy, and he always endeavors to achieve what he sets out to do, sparing no effort to do so. For him, anything good and reasonable is achievable if he has the will and also the interest and effort. So failure does not correspond to his mindset. Therefore, he always concentrates on his work in every wise so that it succeeds in good satisfaction, whereby he does not want to be distracted and therefore gives the impression of aloofness, which is also accompanied by the fact that he often rarely reveals his thoughts, feelings, and emotions openly. The human being is one who values fidelity, has no tendency to jealousy, and cultivates a relationship, which is why he also deeply understands his need for variety, honesty, and freedom as an absolute necessity of life for all human beings. Accordingly, he lives his freedom and also concedes this in an absolute wise to his closest relatives and to all human beings as a whole, whereby he also grants them their own responsibility for their thoughts and actions. This also shows that he is uncomplicated, not prone to drama, and simply accepts it when human beings make mistakes, as he cannot and will not change this, but only advise those who make mistakes and explain the correct behavior to them in detail. In his changeability, his mood can change in a matter of seconds as a result of inappropriate explanations and words to him, so that he withdraws into a form of isolation in a flash, and thus completely and utterly isolates himself from the outside world. This does not mean that he feels offended, just as it is also wrong to give the impression of being angry or otherwise, as this corresponds to a misinterpretation. His behavior is then only that he does not want an argument and wants to be alone to process his agitation, which is why it is necessary for him to be left alone for a short or longer period of time so that he can mentally process and digest everything. All of this does not affect his behavior towards his fellow human beings, as his respect, kindness, and generosity towards them remains unchanged and open-minded, which also remains the case when they have misbehaved. And because Eddie is interested in everything and everyone, he is also interested in the past and future of the Earth and humanity. So I have also traveled with him from the present age far into the past and into the future, as well as to the highest mountains and the deepest depths of the seas and the earth. So he is also interested in everything and anything on Earth, on its surface, whereby he is particularly interested in the oldest desert area on Earth, Atacamaño in Chile, which according to my research is 23.4 million years old, and the oldest desert on Earth, as I was able to find out. The last time it rained heavily in this desert was a very long time ago, but this will happen again in around 20 years, and the desert will blossom in all its splendor. This is because there are countless and diverse seeds in the desert soil, which are stored there and will swell and develop into radiantly flowering plants as a result of the emerging moisture and their ancient fertility, as has already occurred several times in the past 23.4 million years. However, the year 1950 currently prevails here on Earth, and it is called the Atomic Age by Earth humans, but also the Age of Technology, because this development is being driven forward and sought in the future in order to develop a so-called space technology, after which in about a decade, an Earth human from the Soviet Union will fly around the planet for the first time in a rocket capsule outside the Earth's atmosphere. Sometime after that, America will carry out a suborbital flight with a rocket capsule, which will be followed years later by a number of companies preparing to go to the Earth's moon and land there, after which, however, these experiments will be shut down years later and not resumed until the new millennium, when they will be rigorously resumed and will be such that facilities are to be built on the moon and further exploration of the planet Mars is planned. But back to Eddie, and what else needs to be mentioned in relation to his personality. As a headstrong human being, he remains non-committal in his wise nature, and can become quite uncomfortable if attempts are made to change this with him. He is always busy and enjoys working, regardless of the type of work involved. He is fast-paced in a wise way that allows him to switch to and focus on something completely different from one second to the next. However, he gets bored when he has nothing to do or cannot turn his attention to something that interests him. With regard to himself, his own being, his desires, his world of thoughts and his interests, etc., Eddie is very distant and does not like to be peeked at, because his inner privacy is as important to him as that of any human being. So he lives strictly and stubbornly by this rule, and lets every fellow human being's private life be absolutely private in every wise. As a result, his interest is only focused on this when he is approached by the person concerned and asked for help, his opinion, or advice. However, before he expresses himself in this regard, he must first be able to think about the matter in depth and consider everything thoroughly. In addition, he is a rebel against anything wrong that brings harm, so he targets everything and everyone, and also every human being, and quickly recognizes the negative or positive, whereby he is particularly repelled by anything dominant and macho in human beings, because he values the equality of all human beings, regardless of their status, wealth, name, profession, origin, skin color, race or faith, etc. Eddie is a human being who can laugh at himself, and he feels at ease wherever the atmosphere is right, and his fellow human beings can also laugh. If something unfortunate is done to him, he is generally never resentful in any way, but quickly forgets. But he can avoid human beings and contacts with them who have done wrong against him, or said untruths about him. And it has to be said that although Eddie effectively has a very high level of analytical intelligence, he would never manipulate a human being and seduce them into doing something. Because what he himself does not love or would not do, he also does not expect another human being to do. He knows exactly that he is a cool human being in terms of behavior, but that this does not mean that he is emotionally cold due to wrong thinking, even if fellow human beings also misjudge this.
So this is what my grandfather wrote and released 75 years ago, to submit informatively to our entire era population and the Federation regarding you at that time.
I did not know that because Sfath never said anything about it.
Now you know.
Yes, I am surprised at that. But to that, however, I wonder if I really also, well, I mean, if everything that Sfath wrote about my personality is so important that it is then to be mentioned here when you dictate everything to me?
Yeah, that is what Ptah also said when he read everything.
He was here recently and explained that he had been appointed to the panel because another one had died due to old age. Therefore, he was now permanently employed there and could only come here sporadically. You would now continue to stay here, as would also Bermunda, Enjana, and Florina.
That is correct.
That is also pleasing for me, of course, and rightly so. Besides, I want to tell you that it has been noticed again that I am sometimes absent for longer periods of time, because my hair has suddenly grown longer than it would normally be during the time that I am simply here and there.
Which is not a bad thing, and any person may know. Who fixes your hair now?
Bridget, and she is typhier than Karen was.
She must have been a bit heavy-handed.
Yes, but that did not matter. But what I want to say about all of Sfath's remarks, I will have to add a few more comments. And I think I will leave out the whole of what Sfath said about the future, which I also listed in my poem that you brought me from his estate, but which I do not want to mention openly. In addition, I think that everything Sfath wrote in this recording regarding the future should also not be mentioned openly, which is why I will also make a corresponding note on this when you dictate the whole thing to me.
It is simply not good when certain exact predictions are openly named in such a way that they are predictions and not unclear prophecies that may or may not also come true, such as those of Erlmeyer, Mulhyacel, Nostradamus and Wanga, etc., since time immemorial. Such prophecies have generally been explained by prophecy decipherers, know-it-alls and other prophecy decipherers in terms of events and times, as they are simply thought up and fantasized by these specialists, which then terrifies the earthlings who believe in them. This, instead of imminent and inevitable events being precisely named by the prophets, so that their prophetic statements would be so clear that the announced events could or could be prevented if all that is prophesied could be taken seriously, understood correctly and sensibly, and not spread as a vague announcement, but as a correct prediction, whereby the evil could be averted and prevented if it were followed. However, the earthlings do not give a damn, but continue indifferently and irresponsibly in the traditional style, and effectively breed and bring about every disaster. This has been the case since time immemorial, because when they feel like revenge and it suits their delusional thoughts, they simply start a war and let the devil loose, without consulting the people first to see whether they agree or not. For the madness of the war, which the rulers then unleash and which costs vast sums of money, the criminal scoundrels then take the taxpayers' money for this evil and criminal imbecility in order to spend it stupidly and nonsensically on revenge, insane ideas, primitive and pathological greed for power, and criminal murder, by keeping these miserable creatures safe in the dry and leaving them completely scot-free, and nobody does anything against them to put them in prison, while their primitive warriors and murderers of their murderous organizations, which they call military and army, murder fellow human beings, men, women, and children, and are killed themselves, for which they have previously paid taxes themselves. All this because the rulers, at least of those without conscience and scoundrels, can indulge in their war mania, against which the respective people do not do anything in any wise and do not let them disappear in a prison for a long time. But of course, there are their murderer organizations and security forces, the police, etc., who in their primitiveness immediately intervene and stop and prevent this, because they are absolutely the same as those conscienceless and scoundrels of the rulers themselves, so they also use violence and murder whenever possible. All the sensible and responsible people, who are only a small minority who never want war, cannot do anything about it. Like the other irresponsible part, the majority of the people, who in their indifference and irresponsibility are on a par with those of the rulers, who are absolute scoundrels without any conscience.
That corresponds to the truth. But there is nothing that any people or its minority of the righteous can do or undertake against it. If the so-called forces of order intervene, which would have to prevent every disorder, as well as every injustice, and also everything of this nature of the orders and machinations of those in power.
That is so, and you can say that out loud, but it cannot be changed unless the peoples finally think instead of believe, unless they finally put aside their indifference, and instead of indulging in irresponsibility, finally take responsibility and thus prevent the paternalism, lawlessness, and enslavement of the peoples from going on and ultimately ending in absolute and total lack of freedom. Oppression as well as absolute subjugation, servitude, and even serfdom, and worse than in bailiff times. But this is exactly what threatens to happen in the future, because the rich and super-rich will now set themselves up as rulers over the peoples, and, with the help of artificial intelligence, will seize power over the peoples and force them under their will, their lust for power and domination, and their greed for possessions. It remains to be seen how long it will take for the people to finally realize this and allow these power-hungry individuals to take away more and more of their freedom. So the answer to the question is superfluous, and human beings should think for themselves and give serious thought to why it has actually been possible to progress so far that cash transactions have already been largely abolished and payments can only be made by credit card. The indifference and irresponsibility as well as the absolute disinformation etc. by the media of all kinds have brought the earthling to the point where he no longer sees,
perceives and thinks about the fact that he has already become so dependent on the governments through their patronizing and enslaving actions through ever and again new laws, rules, ordinances, regulations and prohibitions, etc., that he now already goes along as an authority-dependent, authority-independent, and authority-dependent person without realizing it himself. This article, which I received from Manuel Brettbacher, proves that effective thinking and not faith is now important, and says exactly what Sfath was already talking about when he made it clear to me about artificial intelligence that it would be used by governments in the future to completely control humanity and make it practically serfs. However, the fact that all this is possible is only due to the fact that the majority of humanity is absolutely and completely addicted to indifference, irresponsibility, and faithlessness, and has effectively decayed, lost the ability to think and act for itself, and to observe, perceive, and grasp reality and its truth.
Godfather of AI reveals the only way for humanity to survive against Super AI Dan triad Geoffrey Hinton, known as the Godfather of AI, has expressed his concern that the technology he helped develop could wipe out humanity in the future. Bowed Dan Try 19th August 2025.
Geoffrey Hinton, a computer scientist who laid the foundations for the development of artificial intelligence AI, recently warned that there is a possibility that 10 to 20% of AI will wipe out humanity in the future. Hinton also doubts the ability of technology companies to control AI. It is not going to work in terms of tech companies' ability to control AI. They will be much smarter than us. They will have many ways to circumvent control, said Geoffrey Hinton.
Geoffrey Hinton is considered the godfather of AI, who laid the foundation for the development of modern artificial intelligence photo, Pinterest.
Hinton warns that AI systems could control human beings in the future just as easily as an adult can lure a 3-year-old child with sweets. He gives examples of AI systems that are already prepared to deceive, cheat, and spread disinformation in order to achieve their goals. Hinton believes that the only solution for humanity's survival against AI is to endow AI models with a maternal instinct so that they genuinely care about human beings, even if AI is more powerful and intelligent than the entire human intellect, rather than forcing them to obey human beings. As AI systems become more intelligent than human beings, they will quickly develop 2 goals. One is survival, the other is to find ways to gain more control. Any kind of AI will try to survive, commented Geoffrey Hinton. That is why it is important to integrate and encourage maternal instincts in AI models, he said. However, Hinton said he did not yet know exactly how this could be implemented technically, but emphasized that computer scientists would have to find solutions to make this possible. Emmett Shear, who served as interim CEO at OpenAI, said he would not be surprised if AI became smarter in the future, threatening human beings and bypassing shutdown orders. AI is still relatively weak today, but it has become much smarter and more powerful. It is not going to stop, explained Emmett Shear. AI is developing faster than expected. Many technology experts believe that AI is developing faster than humanity expected, and that artificial superintelligence, also known as artificial general intelligence (AGI), an AI system that can perform multiple tasks simultaneously, will emerge in the next few years. Geoffrey Hinton said he once believed it would take humanity 30 to 50 years to build an artificial intelligence, but now he sees that moment coming sooner. A reasonable estimate is that AGI will emerge within the next 5 to 20 years, Hinton commented. While Hinton fears that mistakes will continue to be made during development that could lead to AI spiraling out of control, he hopes that the technology will pave the way for breakthroughs in medicine and improve the quality of life for human beings. We will find revolutionary new drugs and have much better cancer treatments than today, thanks to AI will. For example, help doctors to analyze and link huge amounts of data from CT and MRI scans, commented Geoffrey Hinton. However, he does not believe that AI can help human beings achieve immortality. When asked what he would have done in the past if he had known that AI would develop as fast as it is today, Hinton said he regrets having focused only on getting AI up and running without paying attention to other issues. I wish I had thought about safety issues, Hinton said. Professor Geoffrey Everest Hinton was born on the 6th of December 1947 in London, England. He is a computer scientist and cognitive psychologist and is considered the godfather of AI for his pioneering contributions to the fields of artificial intelligence, AI, and deep learning. In 2024, Professor Hinton was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his fundamental discoveries in machine learning with artificial neural networks. Also in 2024, Professor Geoffrey Hinton, Professor Yoshua Bengio, Professor Yan LeCun, Professor Fei Li and Jensen Huang, C. Ao A. O of chip manufacturer NVIDIA, were honored and received the top prize at the VinFuture 2024 award ceremony for their great contributions in the fields of deep learning and artificial intelligence. Geoffrey Hinton, together with Yoshua Bengio and Yan LeCun, is considered the godfather of AI, as their research laid the foundation for many important advances in the development of modern artificial intelligence.
Thinking only after the fact, when something has already been done or happened, unfortunately, it is too late.
Unfortunately, that is the case. But there are many human beings, and you can actually say idiots, who are just believers and fantasists and are not able to think realistically, who assume that AI will bring blessings. They are unable to see the current opposite of the current positive, and therefore cannot even guess what AI will bring and trigger in the future. This was the case in the late 9th century when black powder or gunpowder was invented in China, and then in the 13th century when the first firearms were also invented in China. As far as I know, this was between 1280 and 1290, when the so-called Heilongjiang rifle was invented in China. This shooting device was then further developed and also found its way to Europe and the rest of the world in the next century. It did not take long, namely only about 10 or 15 years, until the so-called handgun appeared in Europe and the first murders were committed with it. Shortly afterwards, 20 or about 25 years later, the first cannon was built, which was mass-produced and also distributed worldwide like the black powder weapons, which from then on found their way into all worldwide military murder organizations, killing, destroying, and destroying. The human beings who were very early alchemists and later inventors of technology never foresaw that their innovations would inevitably be developed further, leading to bloody, destructive, annihilating, and exterminating wars in the future. The early alchemists never even gave a thought to the fact that their invention, black powder, would inevitably be further developed through research and then ultimately be developed into high explosives, such as dynamite, cheddite and aldehyde, etc., as well as various NC powders or nitroglycerin propellants, such as cordite, which are used as cartridge loads for ammunition for rifles, machine guns, pistols, and revolvers, as well as for guns and rockets of all kinds, etc. The inventors of the time never thought about what their inventions would bring.
There I have learnt something again, because your execution has shown me something that I was unaware of.
This is what has happened to me throughout my lifetime.
Because by communicating with other human beings and just by seeing and perceiving the true reality and its truth, I have experienced and learnt a lot, as well as also gained a good knowledge of this and that. But here in the computer, I have something else that indicates that other human beings are also thinking something sensible and gaining knowledge. And here it is Akim who has beamed the following to me.
23 Characteristics of True Humanity.
1. To be a true human being means not allowing yourself to be disturbed from your inner calm, mental and emotional harmony, and inner peace under any circumstances, regardless of what may also happen in your own personality or outside in the world. This is also associated with inner values such as modesty, anti-materialism, optimism, patience, perseverance, and tenacity in self-evolution. To be a true human being in the truthful and real sense of the word means to realize daily that one's own self lives and evolves in all spaces and times as well as in all universes and dimensions in relative perfection and in unity with the great whole. The creation universal consciousness. The human being is completely free and self-responsible in all things, situations and decisions of his life, because there never was and never will be a creator God who rules over human beings, because he only exists in the delusional thoughts of human beings. 3. The true human being consciously strives to constantly evolve in the awareness of his creational being and out of its power and to create true knowledge, true love and timelessly valid wisdom within himself, thereby developing himself, his life energy of creation that animates him and thus the creation as a whole. Through his constant conscious learning, he Yoda-like contributes to the evolution of everything up to the highest forms of creation and ultimately up to the sin absolutum in higher swinging waves. 4. The human being, in the true sense of the word, fundamentally forms an effective self-love within himself. Building on this, in the awareness and knowledge of living and coexisting in everything, he gradually creates the all-encompassing, indestructible love for the entire nature of creation and for all life forms and everything that exists within it, and continues to cultivate this universal life form within himself. 5. The deep meaning of human being is contained in the term Omedam, which means law and fulfiller, and is synonymous with the fact that human beings respect the laws of creation and fulfill its recommendations, which are wise recommendations for action and practical life instructions, as well as signposts on their path to true humanity. Everything necessary about this is written down in the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, or in the goblet of the truth. 6. True human beings never indulge in quarrels, carries, aggression, violence, murder, manslaughter or war, etc., and do not allow themselves to be involved in war services ordered by degenerate state leaders, because war in raw, selfish and dehumanized violence in every respect are always illogical, cruel, destructive, and contrary to creation, whereby man blocks the path to true human being and to his true destiny. 7. The true human being respects and honors all life and all fellow human beings as absolutely equal, because he knows that every single human being carries a spark of creation life energy in his innermost being, which is destined to evolve over unimaginably long periods of time through the enlivenment of ever-new human beings, each with ever-new personalities until he reaches his goal of becoming one with creation itself. 8. The true human being is aware that development will not stand still afterwards either, because creation universal consciousness, as the lowest of the 1049 forms of creation, each of which exists in infinite numbers, must also continue to develop itself further and higher, over unimaginably long periods of time, in order to one day merge with the highest of the 7 absolutum forms, the sin absolutum, whose evolution will also continue into all infinity. 9. This knowledge is inherent in the true human being through the teaching of truth. Teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, and the certainty of his high destiny in him is both an incentive and a joy. He knows that he must always follow the path of evolution of his consciousness and his creation energy in his daily life. For the evolution of human beings progresses in many small steps, which he must take purposefully and by making many mistakes, but from which he learns and thereby progresses further. 10. The true human being knows that every serious endeavor and every success on his path to true humanity remains in his consciousness, or in the creation life energy that enlivens him or her as impulse energy. This is why he cultivates the values of true human being every day, whereby the strong tree of the personality or noble character of a true human being ultimately grows from many initially inconspicuous thought seeds, insights, and ideas.
Creation energy teaching symbol humanity. "12. A true human being does not judge other human beings and does not elevate himself above their faults, weaknesses, and character defects. They do observe human beings and recognize their faults, but they do so in a completely neutral wise. 13. He learns from this for himself by examining himself and recognizing whether he has the same faults, after which he analyzes and neutralizes them. He observes human beings in order to recognize himself. The human being never passes judgment on other human beings and remains silent about their mistakes, but learns from them. After all, correcting mistakes is always fundamentally the individual human being's own business and task. 14. The true human being never places himself above another human being or considers himself better than another, because he is aware that all human beings are connected to each other through the creational universal energy and timelessness and through all spaces of creation. The human being is therefore in truth mocking himself when he deceives or blasphemes other human beings. 15. The true human being is always grateful to creation and all of nature in honor. He knows that the innermost part of creation will always remain an immeasurable mystery to him as a human being, so that it is harmful and hinders his evolution if, in a fit of megalomania, he allows himself to be carried away into wanting to unravel the mystery of creation's innermost being. He therefore exercises patience and works with appropriate modesty on his evolution, which is the highest reward and price of life for him. 16. If a human being wants to be a true human being, he must first of all teach himself in all things of true humanity and dedicate his respect, his thinking, feeling, pondering and meditating to the laws of universal consciousness, which require him to develop within himself the luminous values of true humanity, so that they may shine ever more strongly and powerfully within him. 17. The true human being only teaches other human beings when they ask him for advice and help, and when he has enabled himself to teach through a certain amount of knowledge and wisdom. The human being then gives his help to the other person in a humble, objective, and neutral manner, and without using any illogical force or coercion. The true human being reveals only the pure truth to the seeking human being in a neutral, counseling, kind and appropriate and tolerable form as help for self-help, after which the fellow human being seeking help can continue to work on his own responsibility and continue on his path under his own power. 18. Being a true human being means being able to take a step back and listen when other human beings are moved by something they would like to share. The true human being never places himself at the center of attention and does not seek recognition, adulation, and worldly fame, because these are all unvalues that inhibit the evolution of his consciousness. 19. The true human being only reveals some of his creational knowledge when he is asked for it or when it is necessary to clarify a fact or denounce an injustice, etc., that is contrary to human being. Then he often has to use harsh, offensive, and clear words that ruthlessly expose the misbehavior of a human being, but which are never directed against his value as a human being per se, because the human being is and always remains inviolable in his dignity as a part of creation. 20. The true human being takes care of his physical health and avoids all extremes with regard to his diet, the care and maintenance of his body. The human being cultivates a connecting relationship with other human beings and nature. The human being also cherishes and nurtures his thoughts and feelings in a neutral, positive, balanced way, and always remains neutral towards himself and other human beings, thus maintaining his inner balance, preserving his health and prolonging his life so that he can consciously evolve for as long as possible. 21. A true human being lives in great joy and gratitude that he is animated by a part of the creation life energy, which the creation itself has created, and which enables him and the human beings who come after him, who are animated by this life energy of creation, to evolve into true human beings. He knows that he is responsible for everything in his life, and that there is no creator God, but only creation, the universal consciousness alone, which has created and continues to create everything. Knowing this makes him happy, joyful, and inwardly free, and allows him to consciously organize every day as a holiday in the creational sense on his individual path to true humanity. 22. The true human being cultivates and engages daily in healthy, neutral, and intentional meditation or contemplation in order to find peace within himself, to balance his consciousness and his psyche, and to listen to the creational impulses from his innermost being that are embedded in the depths of his consciousness. By consciously heeding and nurturing the creational impulses and his intuition, and by consciously forming high human values within himself, he treads the path of true humanity. 23. The true human being knows that his personal evolutionary path also does not end with his death, because in the life of death, the creation life energy processes all the knowledge, wisdom, and love he has acquired so far into higher values. The quintessence of all true knowledge, all wisdom, and all love is impulsively passed on to the unconscious of the next, completely new human being in the evolutionary line of creation life energy, whereby the uninterrupted evolution of creation life energy, and the human beings who animate it, is guaranteed by the wise laws of creation at all times and in full until they merge with creation and beyond to the absolute being. Occam Wolf, 16th August 2025.
This thought work written down is good, and it would be even better if it were generally learnt by individual human beings and lived according to it. It would be good and correct, I think, if you would endeavor to also publish this in your special time sign as well as in Aquarian writing.
Then a great deal that is praiseworthy would be achieved and effectively more peaceful in our world. But so far the whole thing is nothing more than wishful thinking. But your wish can be fulfilled. What you want is easy to manage.
Thank you, because I think the 23 points are good and worthy.
I think so too. But look here. I now have questions from someone, namely from a woman, and as you can see here, she asks how life originated with us on Earth. I am supposed to answer that in a conversation with you, as well as this one about the corona rampantly spreading disease because she wants to know what is really going on. And this one about space because she cannot understand why people keep talking about space, because it has not started outside Earth yet.
Nice handwriting. Of course, she writes that she can read the dialogue reports on the internet.
Good. Then I will give the following as answers, as I have just learnt from your grandfather. Although all life originated on Earth, fundamentally in water, it also originated on land. That is why I said earlier that life has emerged from the Earth and the water. But the actual origin for it was brought from the vast expanses of the cosmos, namely through outer space itself, and through all the lowest life teeming in it, such as through space dust, hydrogen isotopes, comets, asteroids, meteors, gases such as oxygen, carbon, helium, and deuterium, etc., as well as through dark matter, dark energy, ice, radiation, nebulae, organic molecules, ionized atomic nuclei, subatomic particles, plasma, and also through foreign particles from the depths of the cosmos or from foreign worlds. These made it possible for something to develop on Earth and become life. Regarding the question about the corona rampantly spreading disease, it was not caused by bats, but was created in laboratories. The whole criminal thing was arranged in China, in that in the 1970s the American, with a vengeance, agreed with the then state dictator of China to create this rampantly spreading disease in a laboratory, which was then bred in 3 widely ramified laboratories. However, other diseases etc. were first created, which were also released several times through accidents and caused many deaths, before the accident finally occurred in Wuhan, which released the corona rampantly spreading disease, which was able to spread worldwide. However, this is vehemently denied, especially by America, particularly by claiming that this or that species of bat etc. brought the rampantly spreading disease. And this lie has always been spread worldwide, with the result that laboratories in other countries are also conducting lying pseudo-research into the origin of the rampantly spreading disease in order to confirm the lying research of the Americans, because the truth must not be known. But I said and explained all this years ago. As far as space is concerned, we are not talking about solar space or the vast space of the sun. The solar system, in which the planets Mercury, Venus, our Earth, Mars, the asteroid belt, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and the Kuiper belt are located, and in which Pluto and many other dwarf planets ultimately cavort. And if you look further out into the solar system, you can see that it is surrounded at its outermost edge by the Oort cloud, which Earth humans call a spherical shell. This is gigantic and consists of icy objects which, according to terrestrial astronomy, are located at a distance of around 2,000 to 100,000 astronomical units AU from the Sun, where 1 AU is the average distance of the Earth from the Sun, corresponding to the large semi-axis of the elliptical orbit of the Earth, which is around 149,097,700 kilometers, around 149.6. According to our terrestrial astronomy, the Oort cloud is said to be the place of origin for countless long-period comets that are torn from their orbit by some external influence in order to wander through the solar system. This Oort cloud is the outermost known region of the solar system for all of terrestrial astronomy, possibly merging seamlessly into the Kuiper belt. According to terrestrial astronomy, the Oort cloud forms a spherical shell that surrounds the entire solar system. And as an Oort cloud, it does not form a disk, but is shaped by galactic tidal forces and the gravitational force of planets and nearby suns. Only after the end of the Oort cloud, which does not end abruptly, does space or outer space or the transition to interstellar space begin, but this is a gradual process, because outside the area of solar space or the heliosphere, the solar wind no longer dominates, but slowly decreases and outer space or outer space begins, which is a huge and almost perfect vacuum, but not completely free of matter and particles. This know-it-all assertion by narrow-minded earthly astronomy scientists only exists in their disguised brains. Moreover, outer space is only an all-vacuum or empty space compared to the Earth's atmosphere, because even if it also contains only very few molecules and particles etc., outer space or space is not empty, as all the cappers and other know-it-alls claim. It is therefore true to say that the actual universe or outer space begins outside the Oort cloud, outside the space of the solar system, as far as Earthlings are concerned, so it is not the space of the solar system. So the space of the solar system is not outer space, as crazily claimed by many know-it-alls and megalomaniacs and all those who are involved in flying to outer Earth space, or the moon, or the vastness of solar space.
What you have explained should be understood.
I also think so, because that is probably all that is required. Then this question here is from Alois Gertner, and he asks what I know about Russia, because he does not understand why the states, or their leaders, and large parts of the European population are so full of hatred towards Russia. As you can read here yourself, he also asks what I can tell him about how it is that a comedian and fool is at the helm in Ukraine, and can beg for weapons everywhere, and thus wage war against Russia. Ukraine is also a corrupt country that he knows very well, because he has worked there for a long time, and also traveled there and got to know many human beings, and knows from many of them that they are Russia-friendly, contrary to what the newspapers and TV news say. Many Ukrainians, as you can read for yourself here, want to belong to Russia and be administered by it, he writes. He also asks here whether I know anything about the old history of Russia and Ukraine, because that would interest him.
Yes, he writes that, as I read here. Do you know anything about both states and how they came about?
Not much, just what I'd learnt from your grandfather when he took me through the past and explained this and that. I am afraid I do not know much more, and I can only explain a little of what I learned from Sfath, because the whole of his teachings on the subject would go far too far. So I will just briefly explain a little and hope that this will be enough to give you an impression. I also have an article from InfoSperber that says a few things that are certainly of interest and which I will add to this. But what I want to say first is the following, which your grandfather Sfath taught me, and which I will now reproduce here, at least as far as I can still remember it after almost 80 years. It is not very much, but I think it will be enough to answer the questions. Actually, the history of Russia goes far back into the past, and it was called something completely different in ancient times and subsequently had various other names. The history actually goes back to the Scandinavian Vikings, namely to their prince, who was called Ruik or Rurik or something like that, and who came to the country around 850 or so and founded the very first dynasty. In the course of time, around the 8th and 9th centuries, after Emmanuel, the name Kievan Rus began to be used for the area or country that is now called Ukraine. This developed into a tsardom in ancient times, around 1540 or 1550 or so, when it was called Kievan Rus, and later became the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, an empire. This is what I was taught by Sfath. And what I still know from Sfath is what is also being asked. I can really only answer the question about why Russia has been so hated for so long by saying that the low intelligence of Earthlings knows no bounds, and that there is actually a clear answer to this, which I will give. There has always been a mixture of political and cultural factors that contribute to this hatred, but they are fundamentally ridiculous. This is because, fundamentally, the hateful rejection and enmity that is harbored towards Russia is cultivated by various actors of the old and new times for reasons of envy, abnormal imperiousness, etc. But first, this. The vast territory of Russia was already inhabited by human beings almost 560,000 years ago, as I saw and experienced together with Sfath. But around 140,000 years ago, a climatic change began, which lasted until about 40,000 years ago, and changed everything. This was the time when the human beings of that time spread across the country again, resettling in the climatically good zones and fishing in the rivers. Russia had always been a vast territory, which became more and more populated as a result of its habitation and reclamation, and consequently the area of the territory grew and expanded. In much later times, immigration took place, as a result of which everything took its course, as is now historically known as a result of research, as well as the fact that Russia, as a huge country, is partly European and partly Asian. Sfath has clearly established that Russia has been hated by the Western states, especially Europe and America, since time immemorial, since the 1750s to be precise. He clarified the whole thing as early as the beginning of the 18th century. The hatred of Russia originated in Germany, but it spread to America and the German emigrants and Prussian emigrants who emigrated and settled there. These were of course united as people of Prussian origin or simply German emigrants. However, they already felt themselves to be Americans, who in the 1750s harbored such megalomaniacal ambitions that Russia, which was a European superpower at the time and whose capital was St. Petersburg, belonged to America. This was because Alaska was a Russian territory on the American continent. Alaska was indeed idiotically sold off to America by Tsar Alexander II in 1867 due to a lack of money at the time. Well, Prussia was a powerful kingdom that emerged in the 17th century, and was only dissolved again after the end of the World War from 1939 to 1945. If I remember correctly, Prussia even became the German Empire in 1870 or so, ruled by a Prussian as emperor. This Prussian Empire was the biggest military might against Russia, and secretly had ambitions to cash in on Russia. But this could not be realized, which led to hatred, which spread not only to the Prussian people, but also to the ethnic Germans in America and also to the peoples of other European states. And this hatred against Russia has survived to this day, and no one can explain where it comes from. But the fact that I have now explained how and where this hatred comes from, which Sfath explained to me in detail, will probably not be accepted and will be accused of being a lie, because as usual the truth will also be concealed here. What I do know is that since then, America's hegemony delusion has been trying by all means not only to discredit the great Russia all over the world, but also to bring it under American rule and to dictatorize it and make it disappear from the political world stage as a might of its own. But to date, America has not yet succeeded in doing this, because Russia is a great power and a regional power that also has great potential in terms of nuclear weapons. Furthermore, it turned out that in more recent times, many states belonged to Russia when the Russian Empire was created, such as Armenia, Azerbaijan, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Poland, and also Tajikistan, Turkmenia, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Belarus as it is called today. Then, finally, the large part of the vast territory became the Soviet Union USSR in 1922, which ended with the resignation of USSR President Mikhail Gorbachev in December 1991, whereby the name Russia was publicized and the state came into being as the Russian Federation. And that is the summary in a nutshell, because there would be too much to say to summarize everything important. So now I just want to show you the Infosperber article, which actually confirms what Alois Gertner writes.
The very different history of the Crimean Peninsula. It was Ukraine, not Russia, that seized Crimea against the will of the local population. Against the will of the local population. Urs P. Gash.
Bay in the holiday paradise of Crimea. Copyright Devoyan/deposit photos.
President Donald Trump wants to force Ukraine to cede territories, the media report. As far as the Crimean Peninsula is concerned, it is worth taking a historical look back. It is often said that Russia conquered or invaded Crimea in 2014. Many understand this to mean that Russia annexed Crimea by force, against the will of the local population. However, there is much to suggest that the vast majority of Crimea's inhabitants welcomed the annexation to the Russian Federation both then and now. Their right to self-determination has long and repeatedly been trampled underfoot. The following facts are usually ignored by the major media or presented differently. 1. Most Crimeans have wanted to be as independent as possible for decades. Since 1991, Crimea has repeatedly campaigned in vain for autonomous status. 2. At the beginning of 1991, the inhabitants of Crimea voted overwhelmingly in favor of autonomous participation in a new Soviet Federalist Union. At that time, Ukraine was still part of the USSR-3. In 1991, Ukraine denied Crimea the right to vote on whether to leave Ukraine, as provided for in the Soviet withdrawal law. Ukraine thus illegally appropriated Crimea against the will of the local population. Fear. Since 1991, the inhabitants of Crimea have democratically elected pro-Russian candidates several times with overwhelming majorities, and not anti-Russian, one-sidedly pro-Western or Ukrainian national candidates. 5. In 2014, after the pro-Western coup against the government in Kiev, secessionists organized a vote in Crimea so that the population could decide on its future. With its military presence in Crimea, Ukraine wanted to prevent the vote because it was illegal under Ukrainian law. Armed Russian soldiers intervened and kept the Ukrainian military at bay. 6. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 was illegal, but not against the will of the majority of the population. This has been confirmed by several Western opinion polls in Crimea. Analyzing the events is challenging because, as in any conflict, there is an information war. The Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea plays a geopolitically strategic role. All the more reason for many sites to try and spin the story. Wikipedia, which is under the influence of the US Wikimedia Foundation, is also not very reliable when it comes to politically sensitive issues. ZVG, a meticulous chronological sequence, can shed some light on Ukraine's recent past. 1783. From 1783 to 1991, Crimea belonged to Russia or the Soviet Union. 18 October 1921. Crimea has had its own parliament since 1921, as the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Republic within the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR. 30.6. 1945. The USSR downgrades Crimea from an autonomous republic to an autonomous region with fewer rights. 19th February 1954. Khrushchev and the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet Parliament transfer Crimea within the USSR from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Crimea retains the status of an autonomous region. 6.3. 1990. The Supreme Soviet approves a withdrawal treaty, which is then forwarded to the Soviets of the individual Union republics for ratification. 3rd of April 1990. The USSR enacts a withdrawal law that gives the Soviet republics such as Ukraine and autonomous regions such as Crimea the right to secede from the USSR or join a new, looser Soviet Union. The withdrawal law explicitly states in Article 3 that a Union republic comprising autonomous republics or autonomous regions must hold the referendum for each autonomy separately. See footnote 2. July 1990. Gorbachev proposes a new Union treaty to transform the Soviet Union into a decentralized federal union, and thus halt its disintegration. Crimea organizes a referendum on the basis of the USSR's withdrawal law. 93% of those voting in Crimea voted in favor of the restoration of the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic as a subject of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and as a party to the Union Treaty. The yes vote corresponded to 75% of all 1.8 million eligible voters. 20. January 1991. In the event of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Crimea wants to become an autonomous unit of the new Soviet Union, independent of Ukraine. However, Ukraine argues that the referendum in Crimea is illegal because, according to the withdrawal law, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic must first leave the USSR. Only then can Crimea decide whether it wants to leave Ukraine. However, once Ukraine is independent of the USSR, it is no longer subject to the Soviet withdrawal law. To this day, there is not a single professor of international law who represents the Ukrainian interpretation of the Withdrawal Act. 13.2. 1991. The Kiev Parliament only grants the peninsula the status of an autonomous republic as part of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic and not, as voted by the Crimeans, as an independent part of the newly announced union. 17.3. 1991. A large majority of voters in the USSR vote in favor of the Soviet Union remaining part of the new proclaimed Union. 12.6. 1991. Boris Yeltsin is elected President of the Russian Constituent Republic of the USSR. 19 August coup against the President of the USSR. Mikhail Gorbachev, on the day before some republics such as Crimea want to sign the new Union Treaty. The coup fails. 20 August 1991. Planned date for the signing of the new Union Treaty. The coup of the previous day prevented the signing. The new union does not materialize. Because the new union fails, Crimea cannot participate in this union as a sovereign republic independent of Ukraine, as it had decided. 24th August 1991. The Ukrainian Parliament declares the country independent of the USSR within its existing borders, including Crimea. 4 September 1991. The Crimean Parliament disagrees and declares Crimea to be autonomous within the Russian Federation, that is to say, not part of Ukraine. The conflict remains unresolved. Kiev has the upper hand because Crimea neither has its own military nor can it be supported by the collapsed USSR. 1.12. 1991. In Ukraine, 90% of those entitled to vote also vote in favor of the country's independence from the USSR. In Crimea, many voters refuse to take part in the Ukrainian referendum as they do not consider themselves part of Ukraine. Even of the 63% who took part in the vote, only 54% voted in favor of Ukraine's independence from the USSR. This corresponded to 1/3 of all eligible voters. The vote on the independence of Ukraine on the 1st of December 1991 took place on the basis of the Soviet law on the procedure for deciding questions in connection with the withdrawal of a Union Republic from the USSR of 3rd April 1990. Article 3 of this withdrawal law of the USSR states 1.12. 1991. In a Union Republic comprising autonomous republics, autonomous oblasts, and autonomous districts, a separate referendum shall be held for each autonomy. The peoples of the autonomous republics and autonomous formations retain the right to decide independently on the question of their residence in the Union SSR or in the departing Union Republic, as well as the question of their constitutional status. To Crimea was an autonomous republic and therefore had the right to vote independently on its constitutional status. 2a. However, Ukraine denied Crimea this right on the 1st of December 1991 and also later, after Ukraine's withdrawal from the USSR against its will. Ukraine thus illegally appropriated the peninsula. 26.12. 1991. It can be assumed that a majority of Crimeans would have voted in favor of remaining in the Russian Federation as an autonomous Crimean republic that did not belong to Ukraine. Dissolution of the Soviet Union. The upper house of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the so-called Council of 26 December 1991 Republics, declares the existence of the Union at an end. The Withdrawal Act thus loses its validity. 5.5. 1992. Crimea adopts a law on the declaration of state independence of the Republic of Crimea and orders a referendum on it for the 2nd of August 1992. This was to make up for the referendum on the future of Crimea that was refused by Kiev on the 1st of December 1991. Ukraine threatens the Crimean MPs with prosecution for separatism. Ukraine will never allow a peaceful separation. June 6, 1992. The Crimean Parliament adopts a new constitution, 3a. It provides for Crimea to be part of Ukraine, albeit on a federal basis. However, Article 9 also provides for association with other states. The Crimean Parliament wants to put pressure on Ukraine to grant it greater autonomy. 13.5. 1992. The Ukrainian Parliament in Kyiv declares Crimea's planned independence law unconstitutional, but promises Crimea greater autonomy. The New York Times comments, Ukrainian President Leonid M. Kravchuk used carrots and sticks, promising Crimea extensive self-determination while threatening to dissolve the Crimean Parliament and use violence if the peninsula continued its campaign for independence. The Ukrainian newspaper LBUA writes, to persuade, Kiev increased the presence of soldiers in Crimea. As Mykola Melnik, the deputy commander of the Ukrainian National Guard at the time, said, the units did not use violence. They only tried to block pro-Russian movements if necessary. The Lieutenant General believes that Ukraine was lucky at the time that Yeltsin did not openly support the Crimean separatists and did not try to send Russian troops to Crimea. 21.5. 1992. Under pressure from Kiev, the Crimean Parliament repeals the independence law and cancels the planned referendum on it. 30.6. 1992. Kiev grants Crimea more autonomy as promised. Crimea receives sovereign rights in finance, economy, culture, administration, and law. Foreign, defense, and monetary policy remain under Ukrainian sovereignty. 14.10. 1993. Taking advantage of the new powers, the Crimean Parliament establishes the office of President. 30.1. 1994. In a separate presidential election in Crimea, which is not recognized by Kiev, Yuri Meshkov of the Russian bloc wins with 73% of all votes. In his election campaign, Meshkov advocated annexation to the Russian Federation. 10 April 1994. The Russian bloc under Yuri Meshkov wins 54 of the 98 seats in Crimea's parliamentary elections. In a simultaneous referendum, 78% of the 1.3 million votes cast vote in favor of greater autonomy. 83% are in favor of the possibility of dual Russian-Ukrainian citizenship, and 78% are in favor of giving decrees by the President of Crimea the force of law. To have the force of law. 20.5. 1994. In a resolution, the Crimean Parliament decides to reintroduce the Crimean Constitution of 1992. With this, Crimea formally remains part of Ukraine, but Crimea's relations with Ukraine are to be as between sovereign states. Ukraine are to be regulated as between sovereign states. In addition, this constitution allows Crimea to establish independent relations with other states and international organizations. 19.7. 1994. Leonid Kravchuk, President of Ukraine until July 19, 1994, declares the referendum of April 10, 1994, in Crimea invalid. 1994 in Crimea invalid. Summer 94. The Ukrainian parliament in Kyiv repeatedly demands that Crimea submit to legislation and Ukrainian law, and threatens to withdraw Crimea's autonomous status. Crimea then undertook not to make any decisions that contradict the Ukrainian constitution. This is followed by power struggles between the president and parliament in Crimea. 17.3. 1995. The Ukrainian parliament cancels the Crimean constitution of 1992 as being in contradiction to the Ukrainian constitution, and removes the president of Crimea, Yuri Meshkov, from office as a reaction to efforts by the Crimean government under Meshkov to tie Crimea more closely to Russia and to break away from Ukraine. On the 19th of March 1995, the New York Times reported about 200 soldiers from the Ukrainian Interior Ministry arrived in the Crimean capital of Simferopol and disarmed Meshkov's security guards. The Taz newspaper reported on protests by the Crimean Parliament on the 20th of March. Following the decisions of the Ukrainian Parliament on the violent intervention in Crimea, the Crimean Parliament convened for a special session on Saturday. There, the chairman of the Crimean Parliament, Sergei Zekov, emphasized that Ukraine had no right to remove Crimean President Meshkov from office. The President of the Republic is elected by the people, and only the people can decide his future, he explained. In their final declaration, the parliamentarians threatened Kiev with holding a new referendum on independence. In the event of such a referendum, a vote in favor of secession from Ukraine was considered certain. The Crimean Parliament also appealed to Russian President Boris Yeltsin to help Crimea. But Yeltsin does not respond. The removal of the Crimean president was possible because Crimea does not have its own army. Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma tells the newspaper LB, "We have succeeded in deepening the dispute between the parliament and the president of Crimea." When Meshkov was isolated in the truest sense of the word, I gave the order for a special operation. Meshkov's bodyguards were disarmed. He himself was deported to Moscow, the expulsion of Meshkov, and the abolition of the constitution can be seen as a coup organized by Kiev. The legal annexation of Crimea by Ukraine in 1991 is followed by a military annexation in 1995. 31st March 1995. Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma issues a decree placing Crimea directly under the administration of the central government in Kiev. The federal autonomy of Crimea is over. Russia is concerned. Sevastopol in Crimea is the home port of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. 18.5. 1995. The Ukrainian Parliament also declares the 1994 Crimean Resolution invalid. 28.6. 1996. A new Ukrainian constitution grants Crimea autonomy within Ukraine. Crimea can adopt its own constitution, which must, however, respect Ukrainian laws. 31st of May, 1997. Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma and Russian President Boris Yeltsin sign a treaty dividing up the bays of Sevastopol for the stationing of the fleets of both countries. From 1997, the Russian government and Russian media criticize Ukraine's cooperation with NATO, especially when the latter also carries out military exercises in the Black Sea from 2005. 21.11. 2004. In the presidential election, Russia-friendly Viktor Yanukovych receives over 80% of the vote in Crimea and Donbass. The election is cancelled due to nationwide irregularities. 27.12. 2004. In the rescheduled presidential elections, Viktor Yanukovych again receives over 80% of the vote in Crimea and the Donbass. However, the election is won by the Western-backed Viktor Yushchenko with 52% of all votes in Ukraine. OSCE observers and foreign observers praised Ukraine for the conduct of the repeat election. Ukraine is politically divided. 7.2. 2010. Runoff election for the President of Ukraine. The pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych narrowly wins the election against the pro-Western Yulia Tymoshenko. The OSCE observers described the election as essentially free and fair. In Crimea and the Donbass, around 80% of voters cast their ballots in favor of the Russia-friendly Yanukovych. The majority of the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine have always been in favor of Russia, while the rest have been in favor of the West. This was demonstrated by the presidential runoff election in 2010, when the predominantly Russian-speaking East and Southeast voted for Viktor Yanukovych, who won against Yulia Tymoshenko, who was favored by Western Ukraine and remained president until he was deposed in 2014. The territories controlled by Russia were not able to take part in the subsequent presidential and parliamentary elections in 2019. Zelensky won against the incumbent President Petro Poroshenko. In the parliamentary elections in the same year, voter turnout was below 50%. The election was won by the Sluha Narodu Servants of the People Party, newly founded by President Zelensky. Official results of the Ukrainian government. 21.4.2010. Ukrainian President Yanukovych and Russian President Dmitry Medvedev extend the lease agreement for Russian Black Sea Fleet bases for a further 25 years from 2017. with the possibility of extending the agreement at a later date. 31.10. 2010 Parliamentary elections in Ukraine. In the Crimean Regional Parliament, 80 of the 100 seats go to President Yanukovych's Party of Regions. Another 3 seats go to the Russian Unity Party, which is openly in favor of Crimea joining the Russian Federation. The Communist Party, which is also not pro-Western, has 5 seats. This means that 88 of the 100 seats in the Crimean Parliament go to parties that are pro-Russian or critical of the West. 21st of 27th of 11th of 13th. The Crimean Parliament takes a critical stance towards Maidan. In 2 resolutions, it demands that an EU association agreement must not lead to isolation against Russia. 2.12. 2013. The Crimean Parliament calls on Ukrainian President Yanukovych to restore order on the Maidan by declaring a state of emergency if necessary. 11.12. 2013. The Crimean government publishes the following statement. Today, Crimea faces a choice, either to endure violent Maidanization or to give a firm response to the anti-state and anti-Crimean forces. That is why we are appealing to each and every one of you to make our common position clear, regardless of your ethnicity, religion, or political views. Ethnicity, religion, and political views. No one in Kiev should be under the illusion that Crimea will allow a foreign will to be imposed on it. January-February 2014. Resistance after the coup in Kiev. The Maidan demonstrations end in a coup that brings a pro-Western government to might. 4.2. 2014. Resistance is organized in Crimea. The Parliamentary Presidium in Crimea decides to amend the constitution and calls on Russia to examine guarantees for the rights of the inhabitants of the peninsula. The Autonomous Republic of Crimea does not have its own military. There are several thousand Ukrainian soldiers in Crimea, spread across various bases, barracks, and naval bases. Since mid-February, an increasing number of armed Russian soldiers and special forces have been blocking the Ukrainian military forces in Crimea. They prevent Ukrainian soldiers from leaving their bases, barracks, and military bases. Voting in Crimea 27.2. 2014. According to Western sources, armed Russians, Green Men, controlled the regional parliament. The regional head of government, Anatoly Molyov, and some members of parliament were denied access. Foreign media have no access to the election. The Crimean Parliament dismisses Prime Minister Anatoly Mohyliov and elects Sergei Aksyonov from the Russia-friendly minor party Russian Unity as the new head of government. The government in Kiev does not recognize the new government. At the same time, the Crimean Parliament decides to hold a referendum on the future status of Crimea on the 25th of May. Foreign media are not allowed in Parliament. Russian soldiers and mercenaries in civilian clothes guard the Parliament. 1.3. 2014. The Crimean government, under Sergei Aksyonov, asks Russia for help to ensure peace and tranquility on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, citing its responsibility for the lives and security of the citizens of Crimea. On the same day, the Upper House Federation Council of the Russian Parliament authorized President Putin to send soldiers to Crimea. On the same day, Ukraine's interim president Alexander Turchinov ordered the general mobilization of the Ukrainian armed forces and submitted requests for assistance to the EU, the USA, and NATO. 6.3. 2014. The Crimean Parliament decides to hold the announced referendum on the annexation of Crimea to the Russian Federation on the 16th of March. 10.3. 2014. The Crimean Parliament invites the OSCE to observe the referendum. 11.3. 2014. The OSCE rejects the invitation because the referendum contradicts the Ukrainian constitution and is therefore illegal. It is not true, as is often rumored, that Crimea did not allow any OSCE observers. 14.3. 2014. The Ukrainian Parliament declares the planned referendum in Crimea unconstitutional and officially dissolves the Crimean Parliament. Russian soldiers and special forces continue to prevent Ukrainian soldiers from leaving their bases, barracks, and military bases in Crimea. There has been no fighting. According to their own statements, the Russian soldiers want to prevent the Ukrainian army from disrupting the referendum. Gabriele Kroner-Schmalz, an expert on Russia, considers this version plausible. The members of the Ukrainian army are free to decide whether they want to switch sides, which many also do, or whether they want to leave the barracks without weapons and leave for Ukraine unarmed. 16.3. 2014. Crimea holds a referendum on the annexation of Crimea to the Russian Federation against the will of the interim government in Kyiv. The referendum takes place without observers recognized from abroad. 3. Voters could choose between two alternatives. 1. Are you in favor of Crimea's reunification with Russia as a member of the Russian Federation? 2. Are you in favor of the reintroduction of the 1992 Constitution of the Republic of Crimea and the status of Crimea as part of Ukraine? The status quo was not on the ballot. The 1992 Constitution 3A provided that Crimea had all the rights of an independent administrative unit within the Ukrainian state, with many powers to determine its own destiny and establish relations with any other country, including Russia, as far as cooperation in economic, cultural, healthcare, education, research, and other areas is concerned. The official final result of the referendum was 96.77% in favor of joining the Russian Federation with a voter turnout of 83.1%. Ukraine and Western countries have labeled the referendum a farce. Among other things, the West criticized the fact that glass ballot boxes and ballot papers without envelopes were used. This meant that the election was not secret. However, glass ballot boxes corresponded to Ukrainian regulations. Regulations. In Ukraine, ballot boxes are always glass, and there are no envelopes for the ballot papers. Anyone can fold their ballot paper as many times as they like before putting it in the ballot box. If glass ballot boxes and the lack of envelopes are a point of criticism, then this criticism also applies to all other elections in Ukraine before and after the referendum in Crimea. There are hardly any Crimean experts who claim that Crimea would have decided differently under different circumstances. The majority of the population was pro-Russian, and there were also economic reasons for the non-Russian parts of the population in favor of unification with Russia. The standard of living in Russia was significantly higher than in Ukraine. Following Crimea's annexation to Russia, the salaries of state employees and pensions there were raised to Russian levels. For many, not only ethnic Russians, the prospect of an often tripling of salaries and pensions may also have been an incentive to vote in favor of unification with Russia. 3C 16.3 2014. Under the headline, Yatsenyuk opens the hunt for separatists across the country, the Ukrainian newspaper Vesti quotes Ukraine's new head of government, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. U.S. Secretary of State Victoria Nuland helped him to might. We will bring them to justice. Ukrainian and international courts will judge them. The earth under their feet will burn. We are doing everything we can to ensure that anyone who feels safe today under the protection of Russian machine guns knows that he must bear his responsibility. 20.3 2014. The Russian Parliament approves Crimea's accession. 28.3 2014. After the Ukrainian government ordered the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Crimean Peninsula on 24 March, the last Ukrainian soldiers leave Crimea. 31.3 2014. Ukraine protests against the Russian annexation of Crimea. The parliament in Kiev votes in favor of cancelling all agreements with Russia on the Black Sea Fleet, including the 2010 lease agreement, which guaranteed that the Russian fleet would remain in Crimea until 2042. Until 2042. Russia considers the naval base to be geopolitically indispensable. June 2014. 3 opinion polls following secession or annexation by Russia. The Washington-based Gallup polling organization asks Crimeans whether the decision to secede Crimea from Ukraine and annex it to the Russian Federation would reflect the will of the population. 83% of respondents confirmed this. The U.S. Opinion Research Institute Pew Research Center came to the same conclusion. 88% of Crimeans believe that the government in Kyiv should recognize the result of the referendum. 91% are of the opinion that the referendum was conducted fairly. February 2015. According to a representative survey by the German Opinion Research Institute, GfK, the attitude of Crimeans has not changed. In response to the question, "Do you support the annexation of Crimea by Russia?" a total of 82% of respondents answered, "Yes, definitely," and a further 11%, "Yes, mostly." Only 2% said they did not know, and a further 2% said no. 3% did not state their position. GfK also asked whether the media in Ukraine reported truthfully. The result: only a very small proportion of respondents consider the Ukrainian media to be credible. Specifically, only 1% state that the Ukrainian media provide completely truthful information, and only 4% believe that they are mostly truthful. The vast majority of respondents do not consider reporting from Ukraine to be trustworthy. May-June 2019. Western journalists on the ground. Later, very few Western journalists traveled to Crimea to investigate the situation there. Infosperber editor Christian Miller is on the ground for 3 weeks and publishes a 7-part report. He summarized his personal experiences and assessments in October 2019. In none of the conversations did I have the feeling that human beings were only saying what they were allowed to say. They were simply open. Autumn 2019, SRF editor David Nauer reports on his impressions of Crimea under the Russian flag. His conclusion: not all residents are happy about the new masters. Precedents for secession, Kosovo. In a non-binding legal opinion under international law, the International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled that the unilateral declaration of independence by the Provisional Institutions of Self-Government of Kosovo was not a precedent for secession. Institutions of Self-Government of Kosovo did not violate international law or UN Security Council. Resolution 1244. Slovenia. On 25 June 1991, Slovenia unilaterally declares its independence from Yugoslavia against the will of the Yugoslav central government. There are 10 days of fighting. After Slovenia adopts its own constitution in December 1991, it is recognized by all states of the then EU within a few weeks. Slovenia thus unilaterally declares itself independent, and its independence is recognized as soon as this independent region has its own constitution. Crimea has long had its own parliament, government, and constitution. Own constitution. What Slovenia and Crimea have in common is that independence from Yugoslavia and Ukraine respectively corresponds to the will of the majority of the population. The difference: no military from the Yugoslav central government is stationed in Slovenia. In December 1990, the Slovenes democratically voted in favor of secession from Yugoslavia with 95% approval. In favor of secession from Yugoslavia. The vote in Crimea, on the other hand, would have been prevented by the Ukrainian central government without the intervention of the Russian military. Democratic standards were not met. Ukraine and institutions close to NATO speak of a farce and create the impression that the decision was taken against the will of the vast majority of the population. Against the will of the vast majority of the population. On 27 March 2014, the UN General Assembly declared the vote in Crimea invalid in a non-binding resolution. Inviolability of borders versus self-determination of the people. In addition to all the details of the processes, the fundamental question arises: is the inviolability of borders more important than the right of human beings within a state to self-determination? The Kurds, for example, have been denied self-determination for many years. Ukraine illegally appropriated Crimea in 1991, and since then has repeatedly denied the human beings there the right to decide for themselves whether they want to remain part of Ukraine or separate from Ukraine. What Ukraine is planning to do in Crimea, Alexei Danilov was one of the most influential men in Ukraine from 2019 to May 2025 as Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council and Presidential Advisor. In April 2023, Danilov presented key points of a 12-point plan for the deoccupation of Crimea on Facebook. President Zelensky has never distanced himself from this plan. Here are the most important points. Demolition of the Crimean Bridge. The car and railway link to the Russian heartland is to be removed. Criminal proceedings against collaborators. Persons who collaborated with the Russian occupiers are to be prosecuted. They are threatened with the loss of political rights and exclusion from public office. Removal of civil servants. Civil servants, judges, prosecutors, and security forces who worked for the Russian administration after 2014 are to lose their pension entitlements and be banned from public service for life. Expulsion of Russian immigrants. Russians who settled in Crimea after February 2014 are to be forced to leave the territory. Cancellation of contracts. Contracts concluded after 2014, in particular land purchases, will be declared null and void. Expropriations by the occupying forces will be cancelled. Release of political prisoners. All Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars who have been politically persecuted since 2014 are to be released and compensated immediately. Filtering and re-education. A comprehensive program is to detoxify the population from the effects of Russian propaganda. Particularly incriminated groups are to carry out public work. Prosecution of propagandists. Journalists and media people who have contributed to the occupation are to be prosecuted and expropriated. Extradition of criminals. Russia, or a successor state, should extradite all persons who have committed criminal offenses from a Ukrainian perspective, including war criminals. Documentation of Russian crimes. A database of crimes committed against Ukrainian citizens in Crimea should be created. Renaming of cities. Sevastopol is to be temporarily renamed Object Number 6. The Ukrainian Parliament is to decide on a final name. Erection of a monument. A monument with the inscription, Russian warship, go fuck yourself, is planned to commemorate the Ukrainian resistance. The strategic role of the Black Sea Russian naval base in the Crimea. The new government in Ukraine cancelled it prematurely in 2017. Google Maps excerpt from Foreign Policy from 19th April 2019. Whoever controls Crimea controls the Black Sea, and thus a large proportion of Russia's cargo ships, which travel from there to the Mediterranean and reach distant destinations via the Suez Canal or the Strait of Gibraltar. Russia has closely monitored the activities of the US and British navies in the Black Sea region. Russia protested through diplomatic channels that the Organization of Sea Breeze 2018, a Black Sea exercise with Ukraine, was anti-Russian. According to the Russian Institute for Strategic Research, it was no coincidence that after Sea Breeze 2017, the U.S. announced plans to build a maritime operations center in Ochakiv, a small town between Crimea and Odessa at the mouth of the Dnieper. When news emerged that the U.S. planned to build the facility for the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet at the Ochakiv naval base, the Russian reaction was prompt. 5. Russian politician Vladimir Zhirinovsky said publicly, "We will drown you there, in the Black Sea, and we will destroy the government in Kiev. This is Russian land." Ocharkiv. 6. Despite the official response from the commander of the Ukrainian naval forces in Ocharkiv that the facility was only available to the Ukrainian Navy and would be used for the annual Sea Breeze exercise, Russia clearly felt that its presence on the Crimean Peninsula was being compromised. Admiral Igor Kasatonov, former commander of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, said that the Maritime Operations Center could be interpreted as an outpost for monitoring Russian forces in Crimea and pose a threat to Russian security. 7. In 2019, Ocharkiv was of strategic importance to Ukraine and its fleet. All statements by U.S. and Ukrainian officials that the main user of the facilities will be the Ukrainian Navy, and that foreign vessels will only be deployed during sea breeze have not satisfied the Russian Federation. Russia fears that Ocharkiv will be used as a strategic base for Ukrainian sabotage missions in the Crimea, the Sea of Azov, and around the Kerch Bridge, as well as for reconnaissance in Western territorial waters. In future, Ocharkiv could serve as a base for aggression against Russia in the Black Sea. The Kremlin views the events in Ocharkiv as part of a wider geopolitical rivalry between Russia and NATO in the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean. This is based on several assumptions, including 1. The West is seeking permanent control of the Black Sea. 2. A crucial element of this is the establishment of a permanent presence on the Crimean Peninsula, in particular in Sevastopol, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is stationed. 3. Since the secession of Crimea, the West feels duped and wants to restore the status quo, or at least test Russia's ability to overcome challenges. Igor Kasatonov, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Naval Fleet, pointed out that the worst-case scenario for Russia would be if the U.S. used Ocharkiv as a base for deploying components of the missile defense system, as these could be directed not only against Russian strategic missiles, but also against Russian coastal missile systems such as Bastion 8. In recent years, NATO has made decisive geopolitical progress in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. In other words, in Russia's near abroad. According to Russian media, operational centers are being established and developed not only in Ukraine, but also in Moldova and Georgia. As Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin commented, the Americans are starting to train saboteurs and special forces in Moldova in case of a new armed conflict with Transnistria. 8. The case of Georgia is also worrying for the Kremlin, especially because the Georgian government has invited NATO to set up a Coast Guard base in the Black Sea city of Poti. 9. There is no excuse me for Putin's war against Ukraine UPG. It may well be that without NATO's eastward expansion, and without the intention to include Ukraine in NATO, there would have been no war. But even if Russia felt hemmed in by NATO, its very existence was not threatened. Russia was certainly not attacked. Therefore, there is nothing to justify the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine.
This is very interesting, but equally interesting to me. As I was looking through yesterday, I read variously on old media that I was concerned about that you were called UFO Meyer, although...
Yes, I know, that was simply attributed to me because I had nothing to do with it. I was called that everywhere. Also in India and Arabia and elsewhere when I was there. Although I never talked about UFOs, I always talked about beam ships. But that was the time when UFOs were being talked about worldwide, as they still are today. It was even written and claimed in the media that UFOs or the foreigners had revealed to me an unspeakable amount of knowledge, contrary to the fact that they, as Sfath explained to me, as did Simyase and Pita, also have no idea of all that creation really is, nor that the entire creation universe is structured in its sevenfoldness, etc. They are not even aware of what creation really is. They are, Sfath, Simyase, and Ptah said, very ignorant in this regard. This is despite the fact that they are very well traveled and have advanced in their development of technology, which enables them to travel very far into space and outer space and to advance to other worlds, where they also spread out and have been doing so since time immemorial, not only in a friendly way, but also in a way that is unpleasant. It also depends on where they come from and what their attitude and behavior is like. Sfath spoke at the time of star systems such as Sirius, Orion, Taurus, and the Pleiades, with a natural passage to your Ankar universe, some 500 light-years from these, but only traversable by your technology. And he explained that because none of the foreigners had the same technology in this respect, which lagged far behind yours, there was no great danger that the foreigners would be able to penetrate the space of your universe. But they were nevertheless ordered to exercise extreme caution so that the passageway would not be discovered by the foreigners. This is because not all of them are peaceful, but as violent and warlike as the majority of the peoples of all countries here on Earth.
That is indeed so. But what you tell us does not explain why our era system is called Play-Aran system by you, and why we Play-Aran are so called, as also our peoples of Era and the Federation were not familiar with these terms at the past time.
That is actually simple, and you really do not know that?
No, I have never endeavored to gain that knowledge.
Your grandfather created that term, and apparently spread it on Era in such a way that it was changed all around for the naming of your system, which I thought was just for me to understand, after which I gradually learned that it also applied to you Pleiadians, and to the Federates. So, according to Sfath, the name of the Era system was changed to the Pleiades system, because Sfath simply changed the name of the collection of stars in our Dern universe, the Pleiades system, to the Pleiades system, and spread it on Era. And now I ask you again, do you really know nothing about this?
No.
Are you not interested in the historical history of your home and your home planet?
My areas of expertise are focused on something other than recent naming, but on the overall history of our planetary system and the Federation very much so.
To each his own, and then something else. You said something the other day about Bermunda and Ukraine having thoroughly fathomed President Zelensky and not exactly being able to sympathize with him. Why is that?
Bermunda says that this man is dishonest and enriches himself by begging, orders his army to death without hesitation and without conscience, is a warmonger and is also wrong in his convictions. Consequently, a cognitive dissonance is pronounced in him.
That is a contradiction in terms, if I remember correctly what Sfath taught me. Is it not? It is supposed to be an inner state that is unpleasant and very contradictory with regard to one's own thoughts and behavior, which is constantly made up for by delusion and fanaticism with mendacious justifications and attempts at persuasion, as well as a lot of acting.
Something like this, that is completely correct. He has a mental imbalance, as Bermunda found out as a psychological expert. The whole thing stresses him out, but he constantly tries to make it seem less than it really is by being active and lying. According to this, he also changes his behavior as required, as is also the case with President Trump in America, who suffers from the same symptom but brings everything to bear in different ways. Trump expresses this particularly through his changes in behavior and the inconsistency of his contradictory attitudes and orders.
Bermunda once said that Trump, but I do not want to say anything further about that in an open, wise way, because I do not want to deal with it. I also want to remain neutral about this, as well as about everything is not my beer, and I want to keep it that way. And the fact that this letter asks whether I am Russia-friendly because I do not speak out about Putin is the same reason. If the media are biasedly concealing what is really happening back there in the Ukraine war, and only ever report on the suffering of Ukraine, but do not report on the war crimes of its murderous organization, while only Russia is made a pig of, where exactly the same thing is happening as in Ukraine, then everything that is said about it is probably superfluous. The partisanship of all the governments of the European states and America, which also includes some of Switzerland's rulers, the very ones who can be described as traitors to their country, and who have made a miserable mess of our national neutrality, is boundless. But in general, it is the bastards in government, and those sections of the population who are to blame for the whole thing, and who have weapons, who are to blame for the whole thing and have arms shipments sent by the mad governments to Zelensky, who is a warmonger as well as being labeled a head case, and therefore does not want to end the war, which he could do practically from 1 hour to the next if only he wanted to. But telling the truth is useless because people prefer lies and deceit to good and correct things. But now, if I may ask again about the foreigners, are those who are peaceful still not contacted by you?
No, that is not the case because that does not correspond with our directives.
So then that is according to the directives, that you are not to contact the foreigners here in the Dern universe.
What you say is so, and has been for a long time, because everything has already been thoroughly fathomed by our early ancestors, which is why we have precise knowledge, and we endeavor to protect ourselves from the foreigners and not allow them to locate us. The fact that they can become aware of our presence is to be avoided. Moreover, it is impossible for them to locate us, even with their technology, because despite its high level of development, it is incapable of somehow detecting and registering our beam ships. In addition, we are clearly instructed by our prohibitive directives that no connections or contacts with any creatures and beings from other universes should take place, because the danger is incalculable that, despite all caution, hostile machinations could be introduced into our realms. It has taken many millions of years to pacify our realms of life, which, according to the earthly calendar, only came about almost 53,000 years ago, and we were also able to bring about peace on our worlds and form a peaceful federation, as well as the peace really came about and has lasted ever since. You know how this happened, how it happened millions of years before the giant sphere appeared, which finally enabled peace to be created.
Yes, I know that story.
Our directives are also the security for us that peace is maintained and that no contact is made with the foreigners with you. It is also good that they are not able to locate us with their technology, just as they will also not be able to find a passage into our Ankar universe in the future, as has been determined for the next 3 million years ahead. To know this is necessary for us, because this must remain so, as it has been since time immemorial. And our hard-won peace in the entire Anchor universe should never again perish, which has also been taught and spread very widely outside our Federation, in the realm of our cosmos.
I know that your grandfather Sfath already made that clear to me, and it would be a catastrophe if the foreign bulbs were to enter the area of your universe, because what would be caused by them would not only be unpleasant, but really a catastrophe beyond compare. But I will leave it at that, because I have a piece of paper on which I have made a note. Can you imagine what idiotic things Dictator Trump has said about America?
No, I'm not bright-eyed.
But at least you know he is a devout sectarian who, Bible in hand, extols and hypocrites the faith just like it says in the Bible. Now he has topped it all off by announcing on television that if he brings peace to Ukraine, he will go to heaven.
That is...
Yes, sectarian tobacco without equal, because you probably cannot expect reason and sanity from the man.
As you say in each case, that beats the bottom of the barrel and that is sick in the head.
Yes, it really is, because this firecracker really is not normal, even if he sees himself as normal and thinks he's an adult.
Physically, yes, but in terms of his mind and worthy reason, that cannot be said and also cannot be determined.
Unfortunately, that is the case with everyone, male and female, who think they are great and powerful, and even the greatest and irresistible. For example, all those idiots in the governments of Europe and their populations who supply weapons and money to Zelensky, the war-mad maniac, and thus continue to escalate the war and even provoke another world war. But these loud-mouthed idiots are not capable of thinking that far. Idiots in the governments and also in the populations, namely all those who are partisan and hatefully in favor of some and their actions, while stomping the others into the ground.
This is unfortunately so due to the rampant low intelligence of the majority of Earth humans, whereby low intelligence is nothing other than non-thinking, but only sham thinking.
Bogus thinking, the primordial cause of which is belief, which emerges as nonsense from religious faith and makes everything real and true, as well as its truth, fade into a delusion, thereby creating evil.
By which you have said that which corresponds to the truth. And that, dear friend, is the end of my presence here for today, for I still have duties to fulfill. So I am leaving now, but I will be back soon to dictate to you everything I have recorded. So goodbye.
Take care. Goodbye.
Sprinkles from the Correspondence 13 by Bernadette Brand.
Obviously, many of Billy's explanations regarding the revitalization of human beings through the life energy of creation are completely misunderstood and misinterpreted. Unfortunately, those who have not thought carefully enough about what has been explained and have drawn adventurous conclusions from it then feel called upon to teach others. In this wise, by mixing the truth with their own esoteric beliefs, they create misunderstandings and uncertainties even among those who are on the correct track of the truth and are very close to the correct understanding. This then leads to questions being sent to me in confused emails.
Question: does creation energy reincarnate along with creation life energy and consciousness, or does it simply migrate from one new body to another? For example, if my creation energy, creation life energy and consciousness leave my body, do they move into a new fetus after a certain time, in which case the term reincarnate may not be appropriate? I heard about this from a passive member who told us, the FIGU passive members, that the new consciousness is empty when it enters the fetus. I thought that when the new consciousness is formed by the total consciousness block, it downloads the learnt wisdom of the just deceased and relevant past consciousnesses stored in the memory banks into the new consciousness. But maybe that is not correct? I would like to understand this.
Response: there is not and also cannot be reincarnation or any form of it. Reincarnation means becoming flesh again, and that would mean that the same consciousness or personality that left a deceased human being would enter or animate a new human being or embryo completely unchanged. The logical conclusion of this is that the burdened personality of the deceased human being would simply continue its further life with all negative and positive character traits and all burdens, and thus with all memories of the past life in a new body, which logically would not lead to any evolution, but only to confusion and overloading of the consciousness and ultimately to conscious and mental destruction. If the creation energy leaves a human body together with the creation energy, which is no longer viable for whatever reason, then these two energies, which always and without exception occur together or are in function, return to their own creation energetic realm. In this area, the creation life energy processes all the stored, acquired and developed knowledge of the deceased human being, together with all the knowledge already stored by all previous personalities and processes, it into a new overall state of knowledge. This process takes some time, during which the creation life energy creates and builds up the new impulses for a new personality. If a new human being is conceived and develops into a viable germ, then around the 21st day after conception, the creation energy moves into the embryo together with the creation life energy and thus not only sets the material life impulse for the independent further development of the human seedling, the embryo, but the evolutionary creation life energy also immediately sets the creation energetic unconscious and consciousness into function. In the same fraction of a second, the development of the physical unconscious and the physical consciousness also begins in the brain of the human being and, via the creation energetic consciousness complex, enters into impulse-like contact with all existing knowledge of all previous personalities and continues to develop during pregnancy. The human being's creation life energetic consciousness begins its existence and work with a tremendous reservoir of intuitional and impulsive knowledge, which is stored in the creation energetic unconscious and which it gradually passes on to the developing physical unconscious. The physical consciousness has to sort and process these impulses, which reach it via the physical unconscious from the very first moment and harmonize them with the foundations of its new personality, which it develops in this wise during pregnancy. During this time, the developing child's consciousness not only unconsciously absorbs the impulses from its creative energetic unconscious, but also the impulses that reach it from its mother, whereby its physical unconscious and physical conscious still develop completely unconsciously up to the stage of birth. If you observe a newborn baby closely, you can already sense its own new personality from its first minutes of life. And it also already shows that it has a conscious and working consciousness with which it perceives its new environment and new life situation, and immediately begins to learn in its own wise way without delay, thereby developing and building itself up. In the course of the further development of the infant, the toddler and the child and later of the adolescent, the human being and of course also of the adult of any age, it can be observed that he has a tremendous creative life energetic potential of intuitional and impulsive knowledge of possibilities and talents from which he unconsciously selects and applies those which he will take up and develop further in his new active life and from which he will ultimately find himself and build up his personality and stabilize it if he is given the opportunity from birth by his environment to develop his own thoughts and work with them in his own, personal wise, without being forced into a belief of any kind. To recapitulate briefly, the human creation energetic consciousness is never empty, but from the first split second of an embryo's animation, it activates the emergence and development of its physical unconscious and consciousness through the impulsive knowledge that is stored in the creation life energy form and that has been worked out, acquired, applied, and held impulsively for all time by countless previous personalities in their own memory bank through the creation life energy. This knowledge, which human beings acquire during their lives through learning and experience, and which is continuously stored by the creation life energy, is never related to personality data, but is solely and exclusively neutral knowledge related. This process leads to the knowledge reservoir of the creation life energy form, gradually filling up more and more, and that the increase in strength and energy also becomes greater and greater, which becomes apparent and has an effect with each new personality.
As a result, each new personality, if it can develop free from belief and in a truth-orientated way, changes and aligns its life more and more in line with creation energy. This entire process is called evolution by us Earth humans,